All right, friends. Here we are, School of Love, this bonus session. I know we're coming down to the end of this after 21 sessions. This is the 22nd session. Fulfilling this download I got a year ago to develop this School of Love, which has been so wonderful for me to be doing research into all sorts of things pertaining to love, how to live a greater life of love and service, selflessness, not only overcoming our egotism, but developing our ego into a great, beauteous, divine being. And yeah, just to let you know, I'm hoping to do more of these come fall in some form. I'm not exactly sure what. So there'll be that. There'll also be the spiritual boot camp coming up in September. So I'll speak a bit more about that towards the end. Wanting to continue this work of giving guidance for personal development so people can tap into a fuller potential as multi-level beings. Because we have so much more on board than we realize, more than we're using. Yeah, it's interesting times on planet Earth. And this past year has been no less so. I would have to say there's been quite a surge in social activism. I was working with someone recently, just over the weekend, someone in their early 30s, and he felt that he had lost a lot of the optimism he had as a child, as a young boy. And he was becoming increasingly consumed in social activism and thinking about the plight of planet Earth. And largely because a lot of his friends were really involved in social activism and consumed by that and looking for ways to save the planet. And this is all very admirable. I think people in their 30s in particular are really poised to step into the ring and tackle some of these big problems plaguing the planet. But the problem for this particular student, this person, is that it was really taking a toll on the levity of his inner life that he had felt when he was younger, as a young boy, where he had felt this magicalness and this hopefulness towards life. And he had been able to consistently shine with optimism no matter what was going on around him, despite the doom and gloom forecasts. And since he had lost touch with this magical inner child, so we did this focusing session on the weekend, and focusing is just this simple but powerful modality where one learns to connect with the felt sense of whatever one is holding inwardly, their bodily held issue, and to bring that felt sense together with bodily held wisdom. And in doing this, the student was able to see how he had allowed the external state of things to become the dominating priority in his inner life. And as a result, this sense of optimism and magical possibility and wonder had got lost and buried deep down in his inner life. But through the power of this modality, focusing, which I teach as part of the spiritual boot camp, he was able to reconnect to this lost part of himself and to bring a tangible rearrangement of his inner priorities, so that now social activism does not have to dominate his life, his inner life, and his personality and his overall state of being. Instead, he shifted into a more of his true self and to live more from there, from the true authentic self, but still be involved somehow in work to save the planet. It was really a shifting of priorities, and it was really quite beautiful. And his face said it all at the end of it, radiating some of that wonder child. He was left excited, radiant, and reconnected to what he called this wellspring of optimism. So when we were done, I told him, well, facilitating focusing sessions such as that is actually my version of social activism for saving the world. And the reason I bring this up is because for me, the problem with the world is intrinsic in human nature. call it the enigma of the human ego, or the ignomatic. The ignomatic. The enigma of the human ego. Of course, I love playing with language, because language is alive. And our sense of language is actually one of the 12 senses, as we're going to hear about today when we get into the 12 senses. And this sense of language is closely related to our sense of ego. And our sense of ego is also one of the 12 senses. A sense of ego, sense that your own ego has of another ego. But what I've been saying from the beginning in the School of Love is that the human ego is the source of problems on the planet. It's the real source of problem on the planet. And I've also been saying the human ego is the source of solutions for the planet. The bad news and the good news all together. Which makes sense, that the problem solution lie within the same. And I love how the indigenous people have had that wisdom for years, where if someone got a snake bite in a particular area, that the remedy for that snake bite would also be found somewhere in that area. So problem and solution are found together. And so my version of social activism and saving the world is not so much taking it to the streets and protesting the corporate ills and so forth, which is certainly needed, to keep governments and corporations from having too much control and influence over our lives, but rather for me working actively within, in circles like this, or one-to-one, such as with this student over the weekend, to help tune the pictures we carry in the depths. That to me is going to the core, is to tune the pictures we carry in the depths, to get the best tuned images we carry of ourselves and perceptions of what is going on in the outside world. In short, how we process the information coming in through our senses, all 12 senses. So the picture and image perceptions we hold as humans is largely what makes us up. The pictures and images we hold as humans is largely what really composes us psychologically and psychically. We're made up of the pictures we hold, like the old style film cameras. Makes a good analogy. Whatever image you exposed to the film inside is what was manifested on the film. And the human mind works the same way. Whatever you direct your attention to with a focused mind, opening the aperture of your mind and your vision, is what will manifest in your lives. It's the pictures that you hold. So much of the ills of the world are due to what we focus on and the resulting pictures we hold and manifest within ourselves. As processing beings, as I like to call ourselves more and more, processing beings, or I should say film processing beings, it is how we process the information coming in through our senses. Because it is the way we see ourselves as ego beings that is the main problem on the planet. And the marriage of the cosmos and earth has not happened to produce us, just to think of ourselves as anything less than that, as produced out of the marriage of the cosmos and the earth, the heavens and the earth. In so many ways, we have given away our power by buying into a picture of the human presented by modern Western science, which is so different from what the pictures our ancestors carried within themselves. And this reductionist scientific method, which has its strengths and merits, has unfortunately reduced the human to a material object, which is a far cry from what our ancestors thought of themselves for all time up until about 5 minutes ago, relatively speaking. And so we're all suffering from the same thing the student was over the weekend. The image of a much greater and more powerful being living with a magical, wonder-filled realm of possibility has been buried and lost under a clutter of other images. And we all feel this collective heaviness because of it. We're all suffering from this collective heaviness. And so, for a start, I hope some of you who were here at the previous session of the School of Love did the love assignment I gave, which was, as Plato had suggested hundreds of years ago, to periodically jump up into the air for no reason other than it feels so good. So if you haven't done it, no worries, we're going to do it right now. Everybody get up and jump up into the air for no reason other than it feels so good. Shake off that heaviness. Thank you, Plato. Yeah. Little Plato. Ah.
Solid call. Right?
Love it.
Yes. Love it.
Ironically, somebody left in the lobby a book. Where did I put that book?
On the shelf.
Synchronistic. Somebody left in the lobby Plato's Republic. Because somehow my jumping around all week manifested Plato's book sitting on the bench in the lobby. So I'm going to find that quote about jumping up in the air, and for no reason other than it feels so good. So good. So good. Yeah, even James Brown said the same thing. Get up off of that thing and you will feel much better. I didn't realize James Brown was actually quoting Plato. Dr. James Brown, right? He is a doctor. He was presented as a PhD. It happened after he died, but he is actually has a doctorate. So, feels so much better? Yeah. The weight of our times, really. There's a lot of weight in our times. Another malady, seeing how we're talking about maladies afflicting the planet, is because the human is caught in its own center. The human is caught in its own center, otherwise known as self-centeredness. Self-centeredness. So an important question the ego needs to pose to itself is, how can a human move more readily out of its own center into a wider range of experience? How's that for a question? And therefore into a wider reality? Answer? The talk tonight. Use more of the senses available. Use more of the senses as means to move more readily beyond the self. And in fact, the sense of movement is another one of the 12 senses for sensing both outer and inner movement. Sense of movement. The senses are avenues of access. So with more senses, there are more avenues for outward access and more avenues to bring in a wider range of perceptions. Therefore, as an ego being, we can experience ourselves as something in a much wider reality, because we experience reality through a wider range of senses, which is the title of this session, the 12 senses as an avenue, as avenues to a greater reality and to a greater you. How wonderful is that? And so in this session, we are looking at a different picture of the human, a picture that has more power and potential, one with greater capacities than is ordinarily thought, one in which the human doesn't have just 5 senses, but 12 senses. And this is based on the work and research of someone who has shown me a lot about a greater picture of reality, Rudolf Steiner. A reality that is not exclusive of the findings of modern science. Let us be clear on that. But inclusive of these things that material cognition can tell us, but also includes that which can be accessed through higher forms of cognition that are available to us when a human develops these other senses and latent organs of perceptions, which gives rise to higher cognition, such as imaginational cognition, which is something I shared about in the previous two sessions that looked at the graduations of consciousness, graduations above and beyond material cognition. So as we start to look more closely at the 12 senses, we will see that some of them are more oriented toward the outer world and working with accessing information from the material world. And other senses give access to supersensible information, supersensible, things beyond the material senses. And what is interesting about these senses is that as we look more closely at them, we should see we're already working with them. But we're not recognizing that we have already been working with supersensible perception in our ordinary lives. This is part of what I want to highlight here, is that we are already supersensible beings working with supersensible perception. Oh, loving this homemade ginger ale brought here by Sean. Although I didn't get any lime in mine. Did you get lime in yours? Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. Yeah. Homemade ginger ale, boiling up the ginger and then straining off the ginger and oh, thank you. Adding some soda water and now a couple of drops of lime. Okay, time for a commercial break here. Last week I was advertising for the Alchemy Pickle Company with their beet brine and their beet kvass. Now we got homemade ginger. Ah, so good. Ginger ale, right, for whatever ails you. These other senses, which give us access to things beyond the sensible realm into the supersensible, giving us a total of 12 senses. And it's broken down into what is called the lower senses, which are directed more towards functioning on the material plane, and then higher senses that are more directed towards supersensible perception and planes that are beyond what's accessible through the senses, and therefore accessing information that is beyond our usual lower senses. And as we look closer at this, we will see that our outward turned senses have an inner component as well, and that we are really quite complex beings in that the outer realm and the inner realm play very deeply into each other all the time. This playing of the inner realm and the outer realm is something that's consistently going on. We just don't notice it. And the so-called physical senses have a supersensible component, which is to say that when we use them, they're playing into our supersensible cognition and the information that is beyond the senses. And so if we actually paid closer attention to our thinking and feelings, we would see that we are already working with supersensible cognition. And so this is so much more, there is so much more to us. And for the most part, we just live at the tip of the iceberg due to this material cognition we have become so settled with. There's so much more to our capacities of logic and analytical thinking that we have not only been talked out of it, I like to say how we've been taught out of it. We've been taught out of this bigger picture of ourselves. And so the purpose of this pre-ramble is to make it clear in our minds that there can be multiple centers, and that is within the capacity of human consciousness to be fluid and moving from outer to inner to outer perceptions, from sensible impressions to supersensible impressions. That we have this fluidity if we pay attention to it and work with it. But what becomes a problem is what I mentioned earlier on. The big problem on the planet is when an ego is too stuck in its own center, which is really the default, is to be self-centered and is necessary to a certain extent for survival purposes. But we need to be able to move beyond that. And having said that, on the other hand, another problem is in what we see a growing experimentation with substances to find power to move beyond our self-centeredness, trying to find the gunpowder that's going to blow us out of our center, or what one of my teachers, Samuel Sagan, calls the ordinary mental consciousness, which he says is more like a crust that sits on our consciousness, obscuring this greater reality. This crust, which I like to refer to as crust consciousness, in contrast to the Christ consciousness. So, why does that do that? Excuse me, I just lost my place. There. Yes, this crust consciousness in contrast to Christ consciousness, which, by the way, is the subject of the second bonus talk I'm going to be doing next week in the School of Love, entitled The Hidden Esoteric Ideas Behind the Christ Phenomenon. So to look at really what the Christ phenomenon is about, that also got buried when churchianity arose, and along with the Roman Empire, and a lot of the truths around this spiritual impulse had to go underground and became known as esoteric Christianity. So the seeking of a higher consciousness beyond the crust consciousness, when sought for with the use of substances, can lead to becoming a little too unglued from our center. Just saying. Which I've seen an increase of over the past few years with what I would call an overuse and over-reliance on substances to do the work for us. And I'll talk about this next week when I talk about the Eleusinian mysteries of Greek times, where they worked with substances for spiritual initiation. But there's always the danger that people can become a little too unglued from their center and end up in another center, like the center across the street, which is CAMH, the Center for Addictions and Mental Health. And that is the center you want to avoid if you can help it. So we need to learn to navigate the centers of our life, the self-center, the inner center, the outer center, and how to not be too stuck in our own little underdeveloped center, suffering from arrested development, which is actually the meaning of the word idios, or idiot. Idiot means one who's caught in their own little world, an idios, in contrast to being able to safely and securely move out from that center, from Idiotville, to explore other centers and be in other centers, but then to be able to safely move back into our own self-center, our home center. And so this is where the 12 senses become helpful, and we don't necessarily need to rely on substances, because when we start to consciously work with the 12 senses, they become new avenues to a greater reality and to a greater self. So I really feel passionate for people to understand and practice use of these 12 senses. So let's dig into them. This is something I studied when I was doing my Waldorf teacher training, which is based on the work of Rudolf Steiner. He started the Waldorf schools about 100 years ago, in fact. And I might just add that his research into the 12 senses, as you might guess, relied on his using more than his 5 senses. He had to go beyond his 5 senses to really research into the 12 senses and these higher capacities of knowing. You could even say his clairvoyance, because he was highly clairvoyant seer. And so this really gave him the ability to speak of these subjects with firsthand experience. But this is only going to be an introduction to the subject this evening. But you will have no trouble finding more information on the subject. There's a lot out there. There's books and information online if you want to dig in deeper. Yeah, just to give you a picture here of the 12 senses, you'll see at the bottom there's the lower physical senses, 1 through 4. And then in the middle, there's the middle senses, 5 through 8. And then at the top are the higher senses, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And you'll also see these arrows connect the lower senses with the higher senses going through the middle senses. Start with the first sense. We'll go in order. The first sense, the sense of touch, which we're all quite familiar with from even the time in the womb as a physical sense. And the sense of touch gives a way to navigate the physical realm. But the sense of touch already brings us into a higher aspect that involves our ego and our egoic development, or our egocation, as I like to say, the education of our ego. What is the high reason? The high reason we experience touch, more than just to realize that if we put our finger in a flame, we're going to burn our flesh, which is helpful. But why do we inhabit physical bodies that we can touch other physical bodies with, can touch objects and experience them, touch and eat food, bump into furniture, hug other human beings? Why? This physical touch has a very high and holy reason, you could say. It is so the ego can awaken to itself. Quite simply, physical touch is, on a higher level, an opportunity to awaken to oneself as a distinct self, which is really important for the ego's education, or egocation. It is through the touching and experience of the other we awaken to self. And that's a big part of why we incarnate. The sense of physical touch is already waking us on another level, ultimately for a spiritual awakening. Our brain and heart perception not only experiences a sense of physical touch when we shake hands or hug someone, but working through the same physical organs of touch and perception, on a higher level, you feel the touching of two distinct beings. So touch is already both a physical sense experience and awakening us to a super sensible experience, which is why the sense of touch, this first sense, is opposite on the circle of senses from number 12, the sense of ego. And even though the sense of sight is a different sense than the sense of touch, there can be a touching with our eyes. Our eyes can touch things. I have a book by Rupert Sheldrake, the famous and infamous botanist from England. You may have seen his YouTube talk that was banned. Well, that's actually was a TED talk that got banned until there was such an outcry that they brought it back. And I have a number of his books. This one is called The Sense of Being Stared At and Other Aspects of the Extended Mind. And in this book, he proves through his research that people can feel a sense of touch when being stared at. And I've conducted this experiment as well, getting people to turn around and look at me by just looking at them and concentrating my attention on them. I wonder if anyone else has ever experienced that as well. You feel something, you look around, you see someone's looking at you. Yeah, yeah. Actually, the spiritual scientist Goethe spoke of this when he spoke of two prehensile arms, he called them. Prehensile arms that go out from the eyes. Prehensile means it's something that can hold on, to take a hold of something, like a monkey's tail is considered a prehensile appendage. But that humans have prehensile arms that go up from the eyes, capable of taking hold of things in the material world. Whereas modern science thinks that we just take things in through our senses. We just take in through our eyes, but in fact, we go out through our eyes and then bring something back in. So this is another radical shift in our perspective of the senses, is that they are actually a two-way street and not just one way. They're avenues that go out and bring in, creating a greater reality for ourselves, and thereby creating a greater self, which is what it's all about. So next is the sense of life, number 2. And even though modern science, again, does not acknowledge this, it is really important to acknowledge there is a life force. And even though all of our ancestors, over all the ages, over all the planet, regarded that there is a life force circulating through living things, modern science has said it cannot verify it through technology, therefore it does not exist. But the thing modern science is overlooking is the technology, very sophisticated technology, in fact, capable of detecting and registering life, which is the life force itself in all things that are alive and living. Our life force is a technology. It's an organ. It's a sense. And through this life force, it goes by many names, such as Ka, Ki, Chi, Prana, etheric body, vital body, etc. This life force that lives within us in our etheric body is the ultimate technology for sensing life and other beings. This is not something that is a technology that can be replicated by science. It's not something that a machine would be able to do, because life can detect life. A machine is not going to be able to detect life. It might be able to detect the manifestation or the vibration, but not life itself. And not only does this sense of life detect things and sense things that are living, it can sense if something is dead or is going to die. And maybe you've had that. You sense that something is going to die. It can sense whether a being is well or ill, the state of digestion, state of circulation, state of breathing, which are all related to life. And Rudolf Steiner gave an exercise to feel in to the qualities of things that are living, flourishing, and dying, and then feeling into things that are withering, decaying, and dying. This is an exercise he gives in his classic book, How to Know Higher Worlds, and is designed to awaken this second sense of life. And I've been doing this every morning with springtime, going out. It's a beautiful garden here at the building, and just being with things that are alive and flourishing. And then other things are decaying and decomposing, the mulch on the ground and so forth. And it is awakening to this sense. Actually, a few sessions back, we worked with this sense of life in the exercise where we sensed the life of a seed in contrast to another object like a plastic ball or a stone. And I have this here. If anybody wants to do this while I'm talking, you can take this seed, this avocado pit, in the one hand, and then one of these plastic balls, and hold it in the other, and feel with the perception of, these subtle bodies. I like to do it from the heart, to really feel from the heart, something that's living and something that is non-living, non-animate, and awaken that capacity. So sense number three. Sense number three, sense of movement. Quite naturally, out of life springs movement. Something living has the capacity to move. A rock does not move of itself. It needs to be impacted by something outside of itself. But a plant, which has life in it, which we can sense, is capable of movement. A plant is moving all the time. And because we're also alive, we have a sense of movement. And this builds upon the sense of life that's capable in the life body. The etheric body. The life body can detect the sense of life, but it's actually our astral body, which is the body of movement, that can detect movement. It has the sense of movement. So science has actually already validated this additional sense in what is known as proprioception. Proprioception. As defined in a dictionary, proprioception is a perception or awareness of movement and position of the body. Proprioception is a sense through which we perceive the position and movement of our body, including our sense of equilibrium and balance. But it's not simply just a sense of outward movement, as with a plant, which incidentally science has documented that plants have proprioception, that plants have an awareness of their movement, their position, their balance in space. But animals, as sentient beings, are capable of both outward and inward movement. And likewise, we humans are capable of outward and inward movement. So this sense of movement is not just outer movement, but inner movement. So we're moving really into the inner realm, the supersensible realm, through this sense of movement. But even more so than what an animal is capable, more on an egoic level, the human is capable of moving in and out of itself. We were talking about this earlier. The self-centeredness that's got humans stuck in their own self and egotism. We have a capacity to move in and out of our own center. And this sense of movement guides us in that as well. We can move out of our center into another center and then move back into our center of origin. We can move our center of reference around. So the sense of movement, again, has a physical level, but then a higher octave that includes our egoic nature. And this, you'll notice this sense of movement sits across the circled senses from the sense of language, right? Sense of language, which is the 10th sense. And our use of language and concept is really is something that engages inner movement on a high level. We'll get to that in a moment. But before we do that, I think we better follow Plato's words once again. To get up and leap into the air for no reason other than it feels so good. So good. Leap and jump.
Leap in front of the camera.
For joy.
Right across the camera.
Woo! Leap so high I knocked the camera over. Oh. Good idea.
Yeah.
All right. Sense number 4. Sense of balance. But first, to finish off the look at the sense of movement, I find it interesting that the dictionary definition of proprioception refers to the sense of equilibrium and balance. And that is exactly right. There is a sense of balance. It is one of our 12 senses. And it is a natural extension for something that has life, something that is alive and growing, and therefore moving, and therefore needing an accompanying sense of balance. When you're growing and moving, you need a sense of balance. And it's not just the fluids in the inner ear facilitating physical balance, as science teaches, that stops us from falling over or falling off the slack line, right? Which Jazz here is becoming famous at in the park, to balance upon this thin strip of material, to be able to walk across this and stay balanced, staying on the line. But the sense of balance, again, draws upon a greater picture of what we're composed. The use of the powers of our subtle bodies, our etheric and astral bodies in particular, that guide us in knowing our position and orientation in space. The left and the right, the front and the back, the above and the below. Also center and periphery. These different orientations in space. Another example is in class. Sometimes we stand in a circle and I get everyone to sense if it feels like it's a perfectly round circle, or where the circle could be more perfectly rounded. And we put a candle in the middle on the floor and try to sense if the candle is sitting perfectly in the center of our circle. And this is more than just eyeballing it. As with the previous senses, there is a component of the physical senses, but there's a corresponding component on what could be called the supersensible level. And our sense of balance has a supersensible side to it. As with proprioception, you could have your eyes closed and sense that you're tilted one way or another. This is a supersensible perception. And so sensing whether we're in a circle or whether the candle's in the middle is using a supersensible capacity. As was mentioned earlier, the senses are really a two-way street that we have to go out into the world and bring back information. So the first four senses we just looked at, the sense of touch, life, movement, and balance, are the ones most geared to guide the physical body in going out into the world. Now these next four senses have a basis in the physical as senses, but they're now working more in a way to convey information from the outside in. So the first of these next four senses is smell. We can see the sense of smell works through the nose in the face. It brings smell from the outer world to our inner world. But where do the smells go? Where do the air molecules ultimately end up when inhaled through the nose? Down into the lungs and ultimately the heart. This shows how the senses of the head, which are in close proximity to the brain, are serving more than just the brain's need for information. The brain is more like a switchboard for information. But the heart is an intelligence as well, where information, especially from smell, coming through the nose, down the pipe of the trachea to the lungs, can be used in making life decisions, even moral decisions. When we smell something, we ask, does this smell good or bad? And we're not just talking about boiled broccoli with smothered cheese. The heart, as a multi-leveled organ of perception, is working with the sense of smell to determine things on other levels. Does this person smell good or bad? Does this situation smell good or bad? What is the quality of the smell? So smell has multiple layers to it, and we do a disservice if we reduce things to just material cognition. Number 6, taste. What was just said about the sense of smell is similar with the sense of taste. Even though the sense of taste is focalized in the mouth, where the tongue gets the first taste test, you could say, where does the food or drink go? It goes beyond the mouth, down the esophagus, into the metabolic region, where our gut intelligence works with the matter we ingested, separating what is worthy to keep and what needs to be eliminated. And sometimes if what we tasted by the mouth or by our gut intelligence is not tasty and does not pass the taste test, it may even come back out the same hole that it went in. Again, showing how these senses are two-way avenues. So both our heart intelligence and our gut intelligence are served by these senses that have their point of entry in the head. The smell and the tasting. The 7th sense, another sense in the head, is that of sight, which is said to be most of all an offshoot of the brain. The eyes are really closely related to the brain. The eyes are higher up in the head than the nose and the mouth, which lead down into the body. But of the senses that are located in the head, the eyes are the ones that go most directly into the brain, indicating that sight is in close relationship with the brain intelligence, just like smelling is connected to heart intelligence and taste is connected to gut intelligence. The eyes are a window for the brain to look out into the world, to see what's going on, to take information in through the sights it sees, the forms, the shape, color, and so forth, giving the brain information to perform its function. Then number 8, the sense of warmth. We're coming to the last of the middle senses, the sense of warmth. When it comes to warmth, it becomes even more obvious how there are multiple levels to our beingness, and that the senses need to traverse fluidly between these different levels and layers. There are actually 3 kinds of warmth. First of all, there's physical warmth. The physical body needs to be kept at a constant temperature, even when the temperature outside fluctuates. So the body has this mostly unconscious sense of physical warmth, and the brain and the autonomic nervous system work to keep a homeostasis of warmth in the inner environment of the physical body. The second kind of warmth, on another level, there's another octave of warmth. We can sense the inner warmth of another. We sometimes say they have a warm personality, or a room has a warm character. But we're not talking about something coming through our usual senses. This is a higher octave of the physical sense of warmth. And this allows us to sense what could be called soul warmth. Soul warmth in a person or a space. Then on a third level, even more supersensible or esoteric or hidden from our usual senses, is spiritual warmth. We may sense a warm or cold presence. This is more than just soul warmth. There is a spiritual warmth or coldness that may be associated with a spiritual presence. We may be sensing a disembodied spirit. We may be sensing the warm presence of the so-called dead, perhaps a loved one who has left their body. But we still have a connection to them. So we experience their spiritual presence and warmth. Or if there's a cold presence, we'll feel the opposite of spiritual warmth. We feel spiritual coldness. This may be that of an entity. Some sort of energy parasite, perhaps, manifests as a sense of spiritual coldness. And if that's the case, we may want to invoke spiritual warmth, spiritual fire, to cleanse this invasive presence out of our space. We can sometimes feel a spiritual fire in the words of others, And these words get us fired up, spiritually fired up. There's a spiritual warmth warming our spirit. So these four senses, smell, taste, sight, and warmth, are called the middle senses. And you can see on the schematic, sit between the lower and higher senses. And I'll throw up the schematic again for a second here. Some new people have joined us. So here we are with the 12 senses. Covered the first four, the lower senses, and then just finished looking at the middle senses. In the middle between the lower and the higher senses. But they're not just middle senses because they're in the middle between lower and higher. They really function in the middle, just as we saw with the nose being in the middle between the outside world and the heart intelligence. And our sense of taste in the mouth is in the middle between the outside world and our gut intelligence. And our sense of sight stands in the middle between the outside world and the inner world and activity of our brain intelligence. So these middle senses really mediate in the middle between outer and inner. And the human, as a transitional being, as I've been calling it, stands in the middle between the lower forms of nature and the higher forms, which is why we need higher senses, which we're going to look at here in a minute. We need higher senses to connect with higher forms of nature. We could say these middle senses we share with the animals. We share with animals the sense of smell, taste, sight, and warmth. The lower senses we looked at, we share with the plant world. Plants have a sense of touch, life, movement, and balance. Which is why Plato said that we should periodically leap into the air for no reason other than it feels good. So I invite you once again to do something that plants can't do, animals sometimes do, and we can do whenever we want. Yeah. Yay. Yay. Yay.
It's good to get that warm.
Yeah.
I know,
Clicking my
right?
heels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Move on down that road. It's interesting. It feels like plants would like to leap
Yeah.
up if they could.
Yeah.
There's the kind of the rudimentary gesture of wanting to leap into the air and to connect with the sun, the source of warmth. But they can't do it. Animals can do it, and we humans really should do it more often. To overcome this weight of our physical nature and the weight in the world, the psychic weight that rests upon so many people's shoulders. Because they're maybe a little too prioritized into social activism and the things going on in the moment, which is going to pass into the next moment. And tomorrow, it's going to pass because it's no more stay-at-home order. Come out, wherever you are,
Yeah, really.
into the land of Oz. So, as transitional beings, we're in transition. We humans are processing beings. We take in information and hopefully do something with the information. I say hopefully because we don't necessarily always do something with the information we take in. And why is that? Because of
Freedom
Of will, yes, free will. We have free will. We don't have to do stuff with what we take in. We have freedom of will. But taking in and using information is all a part of adapting. And adaptation is a hallmark of survival and evolution. And one of the biggest threats to the planet is that the human does not adapt. That we stay stuck in our egocentricity. That we become rigid with the way we are instead of flexible and fluid. Being able to move from our own center to see things from other centers and other perspectives. We're in danger if we just set up systems to work for us, but then fall asleep to these systems and end up with systematized error. Our demise will be due to one thing. Egotism. This egotism, or idiotism, if you will. Idiotism, which is different than zombieism, but I'll have to leave that for another session to discuss the differences between idiotism and zombieism. And so for one thing, we need to evolve and adapt to the fact that we have more on board than we realize. And so here in the School of Love, we've been taking time to educate ourselves as to what we have as humans, and tonight making more conscious the use of our 12 senses. And consciousness is really the key word, especially in working with the next 4 senses. We're coming into the 4 higher senses. And these last 4 senses could be considered the more spiritual senses that open up most fully avenues to the supersensible. So the 9th sense is that of hearing. Hearing. Unless you suffer from deafness, you are familiar with the physical sense of hearing. The ear opens outwardly to the world and draws in sounds. Sometimes sounds we may not want to hear. And the interesting thing about hearing when we're sleeping, in contrast to seeing, is you can't close your ears. You can close your eyes and keep out the light, but you can't close your ears when you go to bed at night. I think there's maybe a malfunction there. It would have been nice if we could close our ears when it's time to go to sleep. But there is also a higher octave to this sense of hearing, which is why it's a higher sense. When we listen and hear things, we not only hear the words, but we hear the meaning behind the words. We hear meaning in the tone of words. Tones have a lot to communicate. Birds, for example, communicate complex information through their bird song, different tones, different pitches, different rhythms, and so forth. How much more are we humans able to communicate through sound? If birds can do it, we can do it too. We have much more capacity for freedom of inner movement and creativity than a bird. And so listening for humans is a rich act, especially when done with a trained ear. But it's not actually the ear. We call it a trained ear, as if you can train your ear to do something. I don't think you can train your ear. We use that expression, but really, it's the entire inner chamber of us that listens. Not just the chamber of the ear, but we are, in a higher sense, a listening organ. Especially when it comes to listening to the words of another human, which can be very rich and complex. When listening with depth, listening can be a very intricate activity. Yes, we listen with our physical ear, but we also hear subtle nuances of what is being communicated, especially when one human is communicating to another. The use of words, language, sound is very much connected to our human genius, our source, our genesis, which is why this sense leads into the next higher sense, the 10th sense, which is the sense of the word or of language. And this sense is beyond any physical organ, such as an ear, eye, nose, or mouth. When we speak of the sense of the word and language, we are working with the higher aspect of ourself. We're working with our higher ego. It is in fact the self that is centrally working in the higher senses. And the self has a sense of language, because language is its primary medium. Language is the primary medium of the self. Even if language is evoking imagery, imagery is also a form of language, which really preceded the use of alphabets and so forth. So a human has the rich privilege to be able to work with the variety of languages available, be it words, images, and this is what allows us to transcend that which the lower kingdoms are capable of. But one can also use words in ways that are not on a higher level. Words can be used to manipulate, ensnare, connive, and oppress others. Through the sense of language, the human can use or misuse words. And if words are misused by another on you, the sense of the word can sense if the words ring true or false, whether the words are authentic or ingenuine. So let me repeat that. The sense of the word that we have as a higher sense can sense if words are false or true, whether they're coming from an authentic place or false. If we hear words from this higher sense of listening, no one will actually be able to lie to us. We will hear it, but this sense of hearing informs us of untruths being spoken. And we should be aware of this, because as Rudolf Steiner puts it, when a lie is spoken, it slays something in the inner realm. Something is slayed by a lie. So this is a great sense to develop. It gets developed a lot in focusing. When people are focusing on a felt sense and they let the felt sense express, which is a great way to just let the truth come forth within you, is just to let the felt sense speak. I will mirror back their words, or I'll paraphrase their words. And then I'll ask them, does that resonate as true for you when you hear these words that you spoke mirrored back to you? And their sense of the word can go, oh, nah, that's not exactly it. It's more like this. So it's a really wonderful form to work in a dyad, where people speak their truth, we mirror it back to them with words, and they see if those words resonate with them. They're using this sense of hearing, this sense that comes through words and language. So these first two higher senses play very much along with this next higher sense, the sense of thought, sense of a concept, sense of cognition. There's actually a sense for this. In order to function on a higher level, we need a sense of thought or concept. This sense, as a higher sense, works with the lower senses. Through our lower senses, we have an experience of the material world, but we need something to integrate that experience of the inner world, of the material world, into us. We need cognition. We need recognition of what is going on in the experience. We need to cognize the experience and digest it on a higher level than our physical digestion. So the sense of idea and thought actually helps us to build our higher nature. We build the higher nature by digesting thought and integrating into ourselves. The sense of working with thoughts and concepts that originate on the physical experience, or perhaps even originating from a purely spiritual experience. We get spiritual experiences that endow us with thoughts. We hear the inner truth of them, put them into language, and then this empowers the 12th and final sense that we're going to look at, which is the sense of ego, or sense of the I, sense of the I am-ness. This sense takes us right to the source of things, both the source of problems and the source of solutions. The sense of self taps us into our spiritual genius, our genesis, our source. And this is a sense, is not so much for just sensing our own ego, although that is part of it. The sense of the ego is for sensing our own ego, but more especially for sensing the ego of another. And not only that, we use it not just for sniffing out the sense of ego of the other, where they're at in their inner life, in their evolution, so to speak, but also through this sense we can develop sympathy, antipathy, empathy toward the other. When our I has a sense of the experience of the other, then there can be an authentic pathos toward the other, where they're at. But until we get there, we're really just guessing where the other is at and what they're like. And we may have misperceptions of where the other is at. We may even have a wrong concept of where and what the other person is like. And I see that a lot in people, that they really don't have this sense of ego alive and working in them, and they project onto the other what they think they're like or where they're at. But they really are making assumptions and perhaps just projecting aspects of their own shadow onto the other. So this is where this sense of ego as a higher sense is really important in navigating this world of other egos. This is why this 12th sense should really be the first sense, and in fact is across this circle of senses from the first sense, the sense of touch. Because on a higher level, we need to touch the other. We need to touch the other, be it a person or an object or an event. We need to be able to touch it with our sense of ego. In fact, Steiner says that the human I is the archetype of intuition, which took a while for me to understand, but this is to say that if we can intuit where we are personally, then we'll be in a position to intuit where everything else is at, because we come from the archetype of our own I. It's like the touchstone that when we're in touch with that, we'll be able to have a greater sense of everything else. So when we get our ego ship-shaped, we are less of a problem to the planet and more likely to have solutions to bring forth. And this will work on the two-way avenues of the higher senses, the sense of ego, sense of thought or concept, and the sense of the word, and the sense of hearing. This then can trickle down to the middle senses and then work outwardly through the avenues of the lower senses. So, there you have the 12 senses. But in fact, Steiner says there are actually more senses than the 12. or you could say more senses to come, because he says at this stage of evolution, they are still in embryonic form. And so we wouldn't necessarily recognize these other senses that are yet to be developed. But stay tuned, because they could be on board in your next incarnation, if you believe in such a thing. And even if you don't believe in such a thing, it could still happen. More to come. So in closing, I want to say, if we are only using the five senses, we have not consciously opened up these other avenues for breathing out into the world and breathing the world back into us. And we are in danger of working with less information than what is available to us, which could lead to being stalled, being stunted, enslaved, arrested development. We are at risk of being subjugated by the world itself, which I've now began calling the dominatrix. The dominatrix of the world will dominate us through just the few senses that we're working with and keeping us at a lesser level. But when working with more of our senses, opening up to a greater reality, it will make us, in a word, greater. It will make us greater. So go for the greatness life is offering us through the fullness of our senses that are available to us. Let me just finish with some announcements here. Oh yes, let's give Jesse a rousing round of applause. Just a few announcements here before we take a little break and have a music video. Well, as I mentioned before, there is the Spiritual Boot Camp coming up, Wave 10, beginning in September. If you have any questions about it, feel free to ask me or other people that have done the boot camp. Or go to the website where the programs are listed, powerforconsciousliving.com. And next week, there's one more bonus session, the hidden esoteric ideas behind the Christ phenomenon.